Hello, everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we are doing a deep dive on drafting red in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which is kind of an interesting topic because, I think the running story for red for this set it's the worst color, right? Propagated in no small part by content creators like myself. But there is a bit of a deeper story, I think, to get into with red, and it's also a really cool opportunity to talk about metagame shifts and how metagames evolve and what you should do when you notice a metagame evolves, or you hear people talking about card value shifting. I think that really applies to red in this set. So we're gonna do a deep dive on how to draft red, my kind of journey in getting to, spoiler alert, I've been drafting a lot of red, and my journey to getting there, and also, the big picture applications of, what this kind of shift means for other formats, because this happens quite often in a format. Not every format. Some formats, there's not enough room for shifts. The cards are just like, the bad cards are just too weak, essentially. Even if the good cards are taken early, the bad cards can't shine because there's just not a lot of potential. I don't think that's the case here for Kamigawa. And let's get into that. Before we do, I want to shout out the Patreon just real quick. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That is the place you can go if you want to support the show, if you've learned something, you feel like you've gotten some value, feel like you've won a few more drafts, some more trophies, but also, if you want to support anything I do, honestly, it's the best place to go. If you like my streams, if you like the podcast, if you like my articles, if you like any of my content I've seen. Speaking of new content, actually, I have also started posting YouTube videos on the Limited Level Ups YouTube, draft videos, that is, specifically. All these podcasts, by the way, if you don't know, go up on the YouTube. I stream them to Twitch. I post them on YouTube. There's visuals there for anybody who wants to check those out. But I also started posting exclusive draft content. That's going to be, about once or twice a week. I've already got about 3 up there. I posted my run from the Arena Open, my pretty deep run, if I do say so myself. So that was fun. So if you want some, draft content from Alex that is not, sullied by Twitch chat and me, wrangling the mongrels, if you just want the direct action from Alex doing a draft, check that out. And I think that's about it. So check out that Patreon. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there, a bunch of Discord rewards as well for anybody who joins, higher rewards for anybody who wants to, get to the $5 and $10 tiers, those kind of things. So I really appreciate everybody who supports, every single week. Let's get into the action. So, doing a little bit of you're probably wondering how I got here moment here. How did we get here? From the beginning of the format, which, mind you, has not been that long ago. It's been 2-3 weeks in this format, but as somebody who's played, 70, 80 drafts, it feels longer than that. But I think it's still really interesting to talk about the story of this format and how it's kind of developed. So, in front of me here, I know if you're just listening, you can't see this, but I've got a mono red deck. This is 15 land, mono red. Arena was down yesterday, and we hopped onto MTGO on my stream. I drafted this awesome deck. Just one of the actual best decks I've ever drafted. It was the easiest 3-0, 6-0 in my life. And it was nothing, I'm not going to say it's not like anything I had drafted before, because leading up to this, I had actually drafted quite a few red decks on Arena. But it's definitely an outlier in just the kind of cards I'm playing and just the density of how many good red cards I got. I think Arena metagames and Magic Online metagames are ever so slightly different, so that plays a factor in here. But the other thing I want to say to kind of give a bit more weight to this is that in the days leading up to me recording this podcast, and kind of, this is part of the reason why I wanted to talk about red, is I've just been winning a ton with red. Trophy after trophy after trophy. I got into Magic Online, did 2 drafts yesterday. Trophy is there. It's been really successful, right? And I think that warrants some discussion, especially for a lot of people who, like I was saying before, may not know how good red can be, essentially. So let's get a little bit deeper into that, telling the story. So the beginning of this format, the story of the format was, green decks are awesome. And this is, again, a lot of this is coming from stuff I have said in the past, a few previous episodes, but also stuff that, Lords Unlimited and Limited Resources and a lot of other content creators, Sam Black, have said too. So this is not just, this is a little bit of me telling my own story of how I got here, but also just the community as well. So green, really great. It's got amazing uncommons, Tech Wrecker, Beseiju, Regis Skyward, and the commons are pretty deep. None of them are amazing, but they're all pretty good essentially at the common level. And I think at the beginning of a draft format, all things being equal, colors are drafted about equally. There's certainly some archetypes that people are more attracted to than others. I'm thinking like snow in Call of Time, where it's like that was the headliner mechanic. It's like everybody wanted to draft that. But I think in most sets, it's about even. And then about a weekend, the trickles of people understanding, this best color is the best color, being, green or black in this format. And, it just, it starts to cannibalize itself a little bit, the draft that is, right? And it's really hard to get into the best colors. And so even though the best colors are the best colors, it's really difficult to actually get into those drafts. And that's what I had really, really found in the past week. And the past week or two, actually, I was just fighting for my life. But, I first pick a Blossom Prancer, fighting for my life trying to play that. It was very, very difficult. I just found that my green decks were medium. I think one of the traps that I've been talking about in this format is getting into green decks for the commons instead of the high rarity cards. Because a lot of times you can go, Fanga Shigeki, 7th pick, and Jukai Preserver. Those are pretty good cards. But then you look at your deck at the end, and it's like, it's not that exciting, essentially. You gotta get tricked into drafting, a color that's not that open just because it's a deep color, essentially. On the flip side of that, the story that I was saying at the beginning of the format, a lot of other people, I was just listening to Limited Resources last night. They had some of these sentiments, too, where they're like, yeah, if I could prefer it, I wouldn't start red. And I think a lot of that comes from experience. And I think a lot of those experiences were not quite, those early experiences, I should say, are not quite representative of how good red can be. Because I think this is one of the rare cases where the decks are being drafted and played fairly, maybe not played, but drafted and built fairly wrong, I guess is maybe a crude way to put it. But, that's the kind of sentiment there to maximize the potential of the color. I think it's being kind of navigated into in a way that doesn't let the color shine, essentially. And I want to get into exactly what that means a little bit later. But I think, now that I've got a little more reps, a few more just like contextually, like how these decks should be played, I've, just anecdotally won a lot with them. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into them. So the other part of this format, right, the other part of the puzzle here is 17 lands, of course, right? 17 lands showing that if you look at the aggregate data, the best red commons are not, they're not performing at the level of even some of the better green commons, or the medium green commons, or like the medium blue commons or black commons, right? Kami Flare, Experimental Synthesizer, and Voltage Surge, they've got pretty middling win rates. So aggregate win rates, mind you. That's important. And aggregate meaning on average in all decks, right? So Kami's Flare is winning about 57 game in hand win percentage, 56 game in hand win percentage for Synthesizer, 56.3 for Voltage Surge, right? So very unimpressive. And that, not every user uses 17 lands, of course, but there is some amount of self-fulfilling prophecy when, the early stats, or, not only the early stats, the stats are still similar these days. There's some amount of self-fulfilling prophecy for a portion of the community will look at those stats and go, I don't want to draft red. And so when they don't draft red, it kind of understanding of what makes a good red deck tick it takes a lot longer to actually get there, right? So people might figure it out eventually, but because people aren't putting these cards in your deck, it's really, really tricky to, actually get to where they might shine, like I was kind of implying before. I also want to confess or give props to Ethan and Ben from Lords Unlimited, because I do think they were onto this really early, right? And I mentioned this in my State of the Format address episode, where I was kind of saying, Ethan and Ben had good success with red, and they touched on a lot of the points that I'm going to touch on and go a little bit deeper on today. But one of the main things that they were saying was that like red player pairs really well with, well, nothing except black maybe, but plays really well with itself, right? And so, I think a lot of the community kind of went, and myself included a little bit, I was definitely optimistic to hearing them out, but I went, yeah, I think they'll come around on red being not that good. I think they were onto something. And I think this is a testament to, one, not just taking 17 lands as aggregate data as, yeah, this is the truth of the format. Because I often like to think that, 17 land actually is usually pretty good in representing a soft truth of the format, for sure. What it doesn't do very well is it doesn't account for individual players, especially good players, right? Finding success in very, like, I guess, localized points, right? So if one player is finding a lot of success with with a deck or an archetype or a card, and they know how to use it better than everybody else or the population at large, their win rates and their win percentage with the deck, their success with it is going to be a lot higher than just the general community who doesn't know where to pair their cards, or how to properly pair the cards, essentially, right? So Sam Plan Black talks about this a lot. If you haven't listened to his podcast, but one of the things he says is, and this is just like, you know, a genius thing, I think, just, of course, everything Sam Black says is genius, but you should trust what players who have had success with something, you should trust their word more than somebody who has had a negative experience with somebody, right? Because somebody who has a positive experience with a card or an archetype or a color will keep iterating on that and keep developing their strategy and keep figuring out, hey, this works with this works with this. But a player who has had negative experiences will go, I didn't like that. I got burned by that. I'm not going to touch it anymore, right? So yeah, like I said, I think shout out to Ben and Ethan. They were definitely on this and really representative of this idea. Moving into archetypes, right? Just to dig a little bit deeper. This is the current metagame breakdown. I haven't filtered for the past 2 weeks or anything. This is just the aggregate all of the red decks, just looking at their lifetime performance. So Rakdos, which is winning at 57.3 win percentage overall, that's actually a really good win rate in the format. So this is the top performing red deck. When you pair black with red, tends to do pretty well. Obviously the Oni Cult Anvil stuff, but the artifact stuff also is like all good synergies. I'm happy being in black red, and my experience and my kind of journey to getting to play the good red decks essentially started with black red for sure. I was like, oh cool, this actually works. The stats pointing me in the right direction, being like, yeah, this works. This was my entry point into red, my gateway deck, if you will, into red. And the other decks not performing so well. Gruul, the modified stuff, winning at 54.4%. Is it 54.4? Boros 53.6, right? Not very good. Some of the lower decks in the format, especially, if you think about the themes, Boros Samurais has not been a good deck. That's just, the theme just sucks. Gruul modified, not very good. Is it artifacts? There's something there, but one of the things about is I actually think the blue tempo-y cards play pretty well with the red aggressive cards, but the problem is a lot of people, I think, are building their decks to take advantage of late game artifact payoffs, and that just doesn't work. The red cards just don't work there, right? So the 3/4 flyer that makes duplicates of artifacts, I don't think that card is particularly good in that deck, because the red decks want to play a short game, the blue decks, or that card in particular, wants to play a long game. Dragon Spark Reactor is a similar one, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think people are putting that card in their deck when they shouldn't, essentially, which ties into blue-red. When blue-red's win rate being lower than it maybe could have, because people are kind of building the decks wrong. Okay, and then from a metagame perspective, after we look at the numbers, and just actually not even a metagame perspective, but an Alex draft journey perspective. How did I get here to drafting red? So, like I was saying before, I was week 1, I was like, oh, sweet. Take all the Kappa Tech Wreckers, take all the Boseiju Reaches Skywards, you get some Fanga Shigeki, some Geothermal Kami, some Fades. Your deck's pretty good. And that was working for a while, right? And then it wasn't working for a while. And then it started not working after a while. It was like, all right, well, I'm just not getting enough of the good green uncommons. People aren't passing those to me anymore. Where do I go from there? And my go-to for a while was Ninjas, Blue-Black Ninjas. I think Ninjas is a really good deck, and I think it's still actually a little bit underdrafted in the sense that the good cards for those decks, for that deck, go pretty late still, at least relative to the other good cards in the format. And it's a deck I actually really enjoy being in. My experience has been green has been cut at almost every draft I've been in, or at least cut to the level that I would not be comfortable soft forcing it like I did before, right? And the next place I go is blue-black. And if green's not open, blue-black usually is. And these are the best aggregate colors, blue, black, and green. So this makes sense, right? But what happens if green's not open and also blue's not open and black's not open, right? Where do you go? Well, the next thing you can go is red or white, right? White pairs fairly well with green, so that was something I was doing for a while. Black pairs fairly well with red, so that was something I was doing for a while. But then I realized something else. I came to the conclusion that if black, red, and green are cut, my next go-to is usually white. but I didn't really have a lot of success with white. And I've actually come to at least my understanding of the format, my thoughts are that I actually rather be in red, a heavy red deck than a heavy white deck. I currently have red above white in my color rankings. And the reason being is that the largest pull into white is Imperial Oath, right? The 6 mana make 3 2/2s. All these numbers. And that card can just be splashed anywhere. The biggest pull into the color is a card that is fairly splashable and goes in decks that splash well, right? It's an expensive card that splashes well. The next biggest pull is Spirited Companion, the 2 mana 1/1 that draws a card. That card's good. But then past that, there's not a lot of draws, even at uncommon. There's a few good uncommons, don't get me wrong. But the other cards are like removal spells, which, as most of you know, removal spells are fine in this format, but not a priority. So it's like, well, if heavy white decks aren't something I am that into, then what's the next thing I do? Of course, we get to today, where in the past week, where I just went, you know what, green's not open and I can't draft blue-black and I'm not that into white, let's try red. And after I got to let's try red, let's just try to get as deep into red as possible, then I had a little bit of a light bulb moment. I saw how the cards all work together. It was performing. I was pleasantly surprised, let's say, right? And led me to a bunch of near mono red trophies in a row. Just like I was just trophy after, and then I've gotten to the point where I've just like kind of started to force it. I wouldn't recommend that. I did that more kind of for science, but just as a proof of concept, very, very heavy red decks have been very good to me. I have a few more here for people watching along. For those listening along, it's just a bevy of red decks, sometimes paired with sometimes paired with blue, sometimes paired with black, sometimes close to mono red, right? So this got me thinking, okay, so how can I reconcile my experience with red, my pleasantly being surprised with red, with 17 lands stats, right? With it being not very good in the format. And I did a little bit of filtering. And if you don't know, you can filter on 17 lands for some really interesting stuff. You can look at how cards perform in certain archetypes, how cards perform in just a monocolored deck, how cards perform over a course of period. So you can look how a card has performed in the past week, for example. Once people have kind of figured out the format a little bit more, you don't have to do how has this card performed over the lifetime of the format. You can kind of go, oh, now that this is a context-dependent card that people now understand how to use, you can look at that and be like, oh, okay, like it's now performing, maybe where it should be, essentially, because people aren't putting it in their deck when they shouldn't, right? So that's the kind of stuff you can filter. And the filter that I looked for is just mono red decks, right? How well are just mono red decks doing? And mind you, monocolor decks have a lower game played win rate, right, than any of the 2 color pairs, right? We've got mono red being played has 2,129 games played, which is, I would say, an acceptable sample size. It's not close to the 10,000s of games for the color pairs, but enough that I think it matters, essentially, right? The other color pairs, I'm a little bit more skeptical about their the actual win rates here, because we've got about 600, 700 games for the other ones. I'm not going to really, compare the monocolor decks here to, or at least if I'm going to compare them, I think you should take it with a grain of salt. But mono red is winning at a 58% win rate, which is higher than any of the other red pairs, which of course implies that red on its red win, heavy red, your deck is like, 17 red spells, performs better than it does when it's paired with anything else. And I think that's the trap people are falling into a little bit. Maybe not trap. Trap might not be the best word, because it's not like you can always get a mono red deck, but you should strive to pair your red cards with more red cards, essentially. And that's what I felt in my drafts as well, right? The red cards just don't play that well with the white cards. The good white cards are all grindy, right? It doesn't play that well with the blue cards. That one's a little bit more of a mystery to me, because the blue tempo cards I found to be okay. It has some mana base issues, because a lot of your cards are a lot of your really good cheap blue cards. I should say a lot of your good red cards and your good blue cards are both extremely cheap. They're like 1 and 2 mana, so you can have some awkward turns where you want to go like Network Disruptor, Moon Circuit Hacker, but you also want to play a red card, and those are all like, it's very condensed in the number of colored pips you need. So I think there's some mana base issues there, essentially. But this opened up my eyes to being like, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper, right? If mono red is performing, at least in smallish sample sizes, better than the color pairs are, what can we grok from that? And so the next place I looked was, well, if people know that red is a little bit less desirable than the other colors, are people drafting it less often than the other colors, right? And I was actually pretty surprised that red has consistently remained drafted at about the same rate as it has throughout the entire format, right? Where it's just like, if you look across the board, all the commons, people have been taking the red commons approximately at the same level as they had been at the beginning, right? And that kind of speaks to, I think, maybe a little bit that not everybody knows that red isn't amazing. I mean, there's probably a large population of drafters who isn't buying that, or either isn't buying that, or hasn't been informed of it, or just like doesn't care essentially. And so yeah, that was a bit of a surprising thought. But then I looked at the other colors and I noticed, even though red is staying the same, all of the other colors have all of their cards. They've gone up in pick orders essentially. So kind of by proxy, the red cards are a little bit more undervalued than the other cards in the set, right? The other colors. So it's not so much that red cards have gone down in value, it's more that they've just become a little bit more available compared to the other good cards of their colors. So my sentiment of, oh, maybe red is being a little bit underdrafted at this point and we can get into it more easily, still stands, even though it's not in the way that I would have expected. So another really interesting thing to look at. So after I filtered by mono red decks are, being, they're winning at quite a reasonable tick. I filtered the stats, the game in hand win rates of all the red commons and some of the colorless commons, just looking at how those cards performed in the mono red decks. And the results are actually kind of staggering. Like, it's pretty impressive how well these cards are performing. So those cards I was talking about before, Voltage Surge and Experimental Synthesizer and Kami's Flare, which were all like performing at the rate of like a middling common essentially, are now performing really, really well in mono red. So Voltage Surge, 60% win rate. Kami's Flare, 58% win rate. Tawashi Song Shaper, which is the DJ, the 2/2 that gets bigger when you play an artifact, 59% win rate. So obviously we've got some, obviously if the mono red decks are doing well, you expect each common in those mono red decks to be doing well. But that is just kind of a point in the favor of, hey, when these cards are paired with just red cards, they perform well. They exceed their aggregate win rate by quite a bit. Like 3 percentage points is massive when you're talking about how well a card performs. So take that in mind. Keep that in mind. And also, again, this is just a testament to the fact that you should be, if you're using 17 lands, be very careful about looking at cards' win rates in the aggregate. Really look how they're performing within each color pair. And of course, now in this sense, in monocolored, right? Because that will really, really affect how well the cards do. And I'm going to get into the explanation of these cards as we get into it. But again, just providing some overall big picture context. So some thoughts on red to close out here on this section. Red is underdrafted relative to the rest of the colors. It is not, it's not like people aren't first picking Kami Flares anymore. They are. But people are picking the other cards, the red, the black, the blue, and the green cards higher. Meaning, you will get some amount of red cards later than you normally would, right? Compared to a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So it is a little bit more open at each table. And another thing is it actually has the potential to be, I think there is the potential for it to spike in openness at a given localized draft table. This gets a little bit kind of conceptual, maybe theoretical, but my thought is that I think, because 17 Lands data is kind of tied down by aggregate data, right? You're looking at the entire player base, or at least the entire player base that has 17 lands. Although you can actually look at the entire player base by looking at average last seen that actually tracks where cards go on average, or where people last see cards in a pack on average, and that gives you a good representation of where even non-17 lands users are taking cards. But my thought is, if there are enough people in a localized draft that have listened to certain content creators who recommend against drafting red, you might have spikes of red being super, super open. And in my small sample size, this is anecdotal, I've experienced that where I've experienced red being open to a degree that I've not experienced any other color being open in specific drafts, right? Not gonna happen every draft, but be on the lookout for those drafts where like, rabbit batteries wheel and stuff like that. That has happened to me. That's how I ended up with those like really close to mono red decks. Some other thoughts on red stats here. I don't love attributing like, oh, red decks, like people are drafting, so some of the thoughts I have are like, oh, red decks are hard to play, and so if they're hard to play, the stats are maybe going to indicate that the deck's better than we might think, or, people are drafting it wrong, and so that's why the stats are lower than you might think. I think there's some merit to that. I don't love always just like, kind of like giving that as an easy answer, and I try my best not to just do that, but I do think in this situation, I want to give a bit of a nod to that, because one, I have found the red decks are kind of hard to play. There's a lot of decisions. There's a lot of, if you're not experienced playing aggro decks in general, that can be a tough thing to do. And if you're not experienced with playing these specific red aggro decks, there's like all these lines where you're like, okay, I have to sequence my, how am I sequencing my 1, 2, and my 3 to get the most damage out? How am I best reconfiguring my Simian Sling and my Rabbit Battery and stuff like that, I think there is a decent amount of that. I don't know how much that actually affects the actual stats. And in fact, somebody in my chat, Danelius, pointed out a really interesting thought that even if the red decks are harder to play, that's not necessarily a argument for them being better than we might think, because ease of play of a certain archetype factors into its win rate too, right? I think even really good players, right, they're going to suffer from red decks being hard to play, right? So you might like to think of yourself as like, oh, I'm a good drafter, I'm a good player, I'm going to play better than, average Joe. But even still, you're going to suffer from that. If that is a factor, you're going to suffer from the red deck being harder to play, which is something to consider. So that's just some thoughts. And I have just some minor thoughts here about how metagames evolve, because I think it's a topic that comes up a lot. And like I said, this is a pretty good, red in Kamigawa. It's kind of a good, a good example of that. And it's something that I think you can apply to a lot of formats. So when the initial color preferences, or just like community rankings, podcasters, content creator first go at the format comes out, I think for a while you can just draft the good decks, essentially, right? Just draft green in this format. I was doing that for a week or two, and I was like, yeah, this is great. This is just working out, right? I was still getting the great black cards, the great green cards. Things were working out. But the question that always comes up when I talk about this, about meta shifts on my stream or just like, in Discord, is like, when do you actually draft differently? When do you start recognizing something has changed? Oh, number one, how do you recognize something has changed? And then when do you actually change your draft strategy because of that? And I guess I would say my biggest thing is when I start losing. Like, when I can't keep doing what I had been doing, when my initial strategy just isn't working anymore because the decks aren't coming together, or other people have adjusted, and my green decks aren't quite good enough to beat the other people's green decks, that, especially in Mythic, where people, the cream of the crop kind of rises to the top, and you're gonna always face great decks. And I go, hey, like, this isn't cutting it anymore, right? I need to find some other strategy. That's when I tend to look at, all right, where else can I go? Can I, like I was talking about earlier in this episode, I went to, started green, went to the ninja decks, and then I found the red decks, right? But the advice I would give is, don't be too eager to course correct. I think I see a lot of the time people being like, oh, no, nobody likes red. Like, people have been talking down red, so I should get in all the red cards, right? The red cards in this format are underperforming for a reason still. I want a caveat. I still don't think, given, if you could make a sealed pool, right, from all the cards in this format, I would still choose, blue, black, and red or green cards, because I think that those cards are in a vacuum still better, right? And those strategies are still better. But things have shifted enough where I feel like it's okay to draft the red decks now. And that's really the thing, right? And it comes from necessity a little bit too, where it's like, okay, I'm not getting those great decks, so I need to shift to something else to kind of, as a survival tactic. But don't get too far ahead of things, right? You don't want to be like, hey, I know. I've heard people don't like red. Let me draft all the red cards, right? Especially if you see red cards late, you can kind of be like, oh, let's get on board, right? The dividing line here that I would make is if you can still get good whatever decks is, green decks, cycling decks in Ikoria, red black decks in AFR, whatever the deck is, keep doing it until you can't. And then you might have a string of a few drafts where you're like, you have to reevaluate and you're like, okay, like I just can't do that anymore. Then you go to the underdrafted thing. But it just like don't try to fix what ain't broke, essentially. That's been my approach for it, and it's worked out pretty well. Okay. Let's get into the actual how to draft red. I know that was a lot of preamble and context, but I think it was warranted. I hope you got something out of that. Let's get into the meat of things if this is all you really come for. So why draft red? First and foremost, well, I've talked about a lot of reasons, a lot of kind of high level, big picture reasons. But when you actually jump into a draft, what are the cards that you start with or get past? Because I've gotten past a lot of these good cards, pick 2, pick 3, either because people don't know they're good or people don't want to be in red. What are the cards you want to start with that pull you into red? Mind you, I want to give a preface that I think if you really wanted to, I think now is the time in the format. I'm recording this on March the 4th, right? I think if you jumped into a draft today and literally forced red, you would actually probably come out with a pretty good deck, but I think that might change over a little while. So, that's a limited time only offer. As the format develops a little bit more, what are the actual cards that pull you in? And there's 5 big ones at rare. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is the Kiki Saga, just one of the best cards in the set. Obviously, most people know that card's good and it's splashable, so that card in particular is not a direct draw from 2 red. But the difference I want to kind of highlight here is before, maybe a week or two ago, I would first pick Fable of the Mirror Breaker and then go, let's splash this. Now I'm going, let's pick Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I'm still open to just being red, essentially, where that wasn't true before. Atsushi, Blazing Sky, Giant Mythic Dragon. I think that one's not hard. But, just one of the cards I'm like, hey, let's draft red. Very similar card, Thundering Raiju. 2 red, 3/3 haste, and when it attacks, you put a counter on something, and the Raiju deals X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of modified creatures you control. Other than Thundering Raiju, very similar card to Atsushi, actually, as far as like impact on the game. When it comes down, just fantastic card. If you ever face this card, you know how brutal it can be. Lizard Blades is another one. It's the double strike equipment, and Goro Goro, Disciple of Ryusei. That card's been pretty good for me too. As you notice, the last 3 have kind of some modified theme to them, and that is a theme that I've been employing in my red decks for a decent amount of them. It's not always a theme, but modified definitely comes up quite a bit. The other reasons to draft red at uncommon, and there's 3 big ones. Kumano faces Kakazan, which is the 1 mana red enchantment saga that pings them when it comes in. Then your next thing gets a counter when you cast it, and then it turns into a 2/2 haste. Just a fantastic red card. Just like so much damage output for so little mana. It's really explosive. Like turn 1, this card. Like, you know how bad it is when you play, or you know how bad you feel when your opponent plays turn 1 Reckoner Raid or Okiba Reckoner Raid, the Black Saga. I feel worse when my opponent plays this. I'm just like, oh my god, this is gonna be a nightmare. I mean, if they have good follow-ups, of course, right? And they're not just putting it in their like, red-white deck with like, it's kind of mopey. But even then, actually, that's actually pretty good too. So Kenzen Smelter. This is the 2/2 for 2 that you can sack an artifact at the beginning of your combat and make a 3/1. A lot of little combos with that. Really outputs a lot of damage really quickly. And one that I think not maybe everybody has been turned on to, but I think this card, at least as on people's radars, is Patchwork Automaton. I do want to get into a little bit of depth on these cards a little bit later. This is kind of just an overview, reasons they head into red. But Patchwork Automaton is just like, so as good as Boseiju Reaches Skyward is in the green decks, this card is that good in the red decks. It's just like a huge reason to be red. I see this as a red card. It's an artifact. By the way, I should read this card. It's 2 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature, ward 2. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Patchwork Automaton. Fantastic card. Like I said, a huge pull into red. If you can get to like 11, 12 artifacts, it's great. If you get past that, it's ridiculous. I had an opponent mull to like 5, I think, on day 2 of the open. They had 2 of these in their opening hand, and the game was over really, really quickly. I was like, oh, sweet. They mulled to 5. I'm going to win this game. Nope. I lost that game pretty handily. So keep this one on your radar. It's just to put some numbers to it. I'm gonna put some numbers to these cards after. I believe in mono red, where you can get a lot of artifacts pretty easily. It's winning at 65 game in hand win rate currently, which is just like one of the best cards in the set, like comparable to one of the best cards in the set, essentially. Another reason to draft red, and I've kind of touched on this, is a lot of the good cards go pretty late. Experimental Synthesizer, which is the 1-mana artifact that comes in, exiles something up top of your library. You can play it until in a turn. You can sack it to make a samurai and do the same. Or you can sacrifice this. If you sacrifice this thing anyway, you get a card off the top, but it has this built-in sack outlet. This card is definitely, it's definitely not as underdrafted as it used to be. It is actually one of the cards that has changed. I was noting how the red cards have not changed their pick orders amongst the community much. This card actually has shot up quite a bit. But it's still, just like I was saying, red can have some spikes of it being really open in some pods. I've still seen some pods where this card goes like close to last, essentially. So this is a good, like, one of the reasons you want to get into red is just like, hey, you see this late? That's a pretty nice, little nice open there. And then you've got stuff like Iron Apprentice, Searchlight Companion, Papercraft Decoy. Again, I'm talking about these cards in the context of close to mono red. I should probably bring that up again. I'm not looking at aggregate stats anymore when I'm talking about these cards. I'm talking about in close to mono red, or very, very heavy red. And these three cards, Iron Apprentice, 1-mana 1/1, enters the counter. When it dies, you move its counter somewhere. Searchlight Companion, 1-mana 1/1, 3-mana 1/1 flyer artifact that makes a 1/1 colorless spirit token. And even Papercraft Decoy, which I think is a little bit of a sleeper. It's a card I've been pretty happy with, but one that I don't think sees a lot of play. The 2-mana 2/1, when it leaves the battlefield, you can pay 2 to draw a card. All of these cards are performing at the level in mono red where the good green commons are essentially in their decks, and even above that, it's in some respects, right? Like Searchlight Companion, I think, is winning at like 59% game in hand win rate or something. Like it's pretty astounding, actually. Just like, if you, again, going to those filters, just when you filter by different decks, you can really get some really interesting results on how cards are overperforming or underperforming. So basically, it comes down to there's a few really, really good uncommons. There's a few really, really, really good rares that you should take and shouldn't be afraid of, moving into red. And the cards that are overperformers in the red deck at common tend to go pretty late. I should also mention that you should think of artifacts in this set, like colorless ones, mostly as red cards. Or maybe that's not the way to look at it. Maybe look at it in reverse. If you're looking at red cards or for red cards for your red deck, look at the artifacts. They tend to be red cards because a lot of things that make the red decks tick tend to be artifacts. So Iron Apprentice, just by virtue of being an artifact, does go up quite a bit in value. Water break. Okay, as I was saying, let's get into some actual numbers here. So looking at the uncommons, Patchwork Automaton, it's winning at 65.3 in mono red, which is just like, again, phenomenal. Just absolutely incredible. Kumanu faces Kakazan. It's very similar. 65.1% game in hand win rate. Also phenomenal. Twin Shot Sniper. We know that card's good, obviously. And then Sekenzen Smelter is winning at 62%. 62.3%. This is a really good card. You tend to have a lot of artifacts in these decks. Sekenzen Smelter is actually kind of an interesting one because it's been really, really good for me in some of my red decks and then kind of mediocre in others. So basically, if you've got experimental synthesizers, that's great. You can sacrifice that, get a card off it, get a 3/1. It just turns into basically turns your synthesizer into instead of getting a 2/2 when you crack it naturally, you get a 3/1 haste, and you have to pay 1 for that instead of 2, which is just a really good deal. And then I've had other decks where I'm like, I don't really want to sack my, my 3-mana artifact creature or whatever it is, right? We're just like, upgrading into a 2/2 doesn't matter that much. It's very, very good in red-black, specifically if you have Anvil, because you can turn your Anvil creatures, your 1/1s into 3/1s each turn, and you get that, you get the leaves, the battlefield trigger, so it just replaces itself, essentially. But just be on the lookout that while Sekenzen Smelter is really, really good, it has some opportunity to kind of falter in some decks. Then kind of a surprising one, High Speed Hoverbike, really, really good. Maybe not surprising, but I guess an overperformer, winning at 61.6 in mono red. And if you look at the card, it makes sense, right? Just like 2/2 Flash Flyer, gets in, the tap ability gets in for some amount of damage. The 2/2 flyer you really appreciate. It's an artifact, of course. So another card that's like not quite on the level of those other cards, but pretty darn good. Rabbit Battery is a cool one too. It's winning at 58.7% game in hand win rate. Just like you really, really like 1-drops in this deck. If you like my best red decks, for those who haven't been watching, have been listening, they all had like a gigantic red pile. It was just like, if I can help it, I want like 11, 12, a gigantic 1-drop pile. I had like 11 or 12 1-drops in those decks, and Rabbit Battery is just like one of the better ones in that deck. Similar to Simian Sling, but just giving haste and being reconfigured for a single mana is really, really good. Also, note on this card, and any reconfigure card, I suppose, the kind of play pattern of tapping it to crew a vehicle and then equipping it so that you get both, kind of like the best of both worlds. You get to have your cake and eat it too, where you get to crew your vehicle and that +1/+1 on the Rabbit Battery gets into combat. You can even put it on your hover bike, on your vehicle or whatever. So worth noting there. Another, like, this is like kind of a side note, but something I have messed up multiple times, and I've seen my opponent mess up multiple times, is forgetting they have like a Simian Sling equipped to their creature, and like the Simian Sling or the Rabbit Battery or the boar, whatever reconfigure creature, sometimes it's beneficial to unequip them so that they can attack as a standalone creature. And of course, they like don't have summoning sickness. They've been on the battlefield. I've had a lot of opponents, or like sometimes you need to block, right? You need extra blocker. Had a lot of opponents concede in spots where it's like, oh, they can just kill me if they they unequip, or like miss lethal when they could have just unequipped or something. So just a little play pattern thing. Let's move into commons now. So again, I think it's really, I'm gonna go through them here, but I think it's really helpful if you want to get a better sense of just like how much different the red commons are performing in specifically mono red or close to mono red, very heavy red, compared to their aggregate win rate, right? I'm just gonna go down the list here. These are all cards within 58% game in hand win rate or higher. Voltage Surge at 60, Tawashi Songshaper at 59, Kami's Flare at 58, Shattered States Era at 58, Unstoppable Ogre at 58, and then we get to Experimental Synthesizer at 57. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I also want to talk about Shattered States Era for just quickly. That one's got extremely low sample size, only 300 game in hand, so take that one with a grain of salt. But I have liked the Shattered States Era in these mono red decks, just like from experience. You do want to make your curve low, but like I've found it fine as one, a singular top end card essentially. By the way, this is the red saga that like steals something and then flips into a 3/3. Unstoppable Ogre is a really interesting one as a card that I always joke about it as like calling it Stoppable Ogre, but in these decks where you've got a lot of 1s and a lot of 2s and you're always guaranteed to have a 1 into 2, Unstoppable Ogre kind of just says like 3 mana 4/1, deal your opponent 4 points, which is just a good aggressive card. So if Unstoppable Ogre has to block the turn it comes down, it's pretty miserable. But in these decks, it really overperforms. Also, I should note like Tawashi Songshaper as the 2 mana 2/2 artifact creature. When you've got a lot of cheap cards, and that's a priority for these decks, of course, this card gets a lot better because you can like multiple times a turn get the trigger, and it can attack for like 5, which is awesome. So just really, I think when you're drafting the red decks, I think it's at least for me, I had kind of a mental like a sense of how good these cards were, and I was drafting based on kind of a pick order-ish order of 17 lands aggregate data. If you look at the numbers just in filtered for just mono red, it actually changes the priorities quite a bit. So be aware of that. Okay, Experimental Synthesizer is a card I want to call out specifically. So I noted all those cards that were like winning at a pretty high win percentage in mono red. This one is winning at a 57.9 game in hand win rate, which is still very good. Don't get me wrong, but it's one of the top performing commons in aggregate, which is pretty interesting. And I'm not exactly sure what that implies. I think that a few things I've seen. So here's my theory, right? I think maybe when people are building mono red, they're not being critical enough of making sure their curve is extremely, extremely low. And if I haven't made it clear, you definitely want your curve to be extremely, extremely low, both because, just the typical, you want your aggro deck's curve to be low, but also you really, really want to enable your synthesizers. If you miss on a synthesizer, it's not the end of the world, but you would really, really like to, on turn 3 or on turn 4, be able to go play my synthesizer, play a land off of it, or play a spell off of it early in the game. Like, you don't want this to necessarily be, this is the last thing in my hand I can cast. You want it to be a 1-mana artifact that can, like, sacrifice to Sekindin Smelter, or to trigger your 2/2 Song Shaper, right? Like, you want to be able to play this card early, and to be able to do that, you really have to be critical about how many expensive cards you have, right? Like, I really don't want more. 3 drops are a bit iffy. 4 drops and 5 drops get even sketchier. So, like, not that I'm not going to play them. There are some that I want to play, but those, you have to be very careful about the ones you choose to play, because those have to be real standouts, essentially. So yeah, if I can have a good synthesizer deck where I've just got like all 1s and all 2s, you kind of get to enact this game plan where you get all this chip damage early, like big early bursts of damage, and sometimes you just kill them, which is great. But sometimes when they stabilize, synthesizer becomes your plan of, oh, I can actually just start to grind them out. And that's my ideal red deck in general, is if I can be like aggressive early and then grind them out a bit later with synthesizers, or there's a few other cards that I'm going to talk about that you can kind of, they're kind of analogs to synthesizer, essentially. So yeah, I guess my big picture point here is, if you are synthesizing, make sure you have an extremely low curve, and I think it will perform better than the win rate here implies, essentially. But I might be missing something where, you know, it's just maybe not as critical of a part to the deck as I would have thought, essentially. Okay, I want to talk about the 2 removal spells, Voltage Surge and Kami's Flare. Voltage Surge is performing much better in these decks than Kami's Flare, which I think makes sense. I would also not be surprised if you told me the opposite was true, where Kami's Flare was doing better, because you know, the 2 damage rider on Kami's Flare definitely matters. But I think Voltage Surge like makes a little bit more sense to me, being like a 1-mana interaction spell. Like, when you can go 1 mana, kill your 2-drop, kill your 3-drop, and then attack and play another creature, that's a really, really good exchange, rather than having to spend like your full turn 3 casting a Kami Flare. Instead, you can go Surge plus a 2-drop, which is just like a huge tempo swing. And of course, Voltage Surge can hit the bigger things, right? So often in your red aggressive decks, or just your aggressive decks in general, there's this idea that there's kind of a trade-off, right? Where you would like your removal spells to be cheap, so that they can hit, you know, you can cast them early, they don't take a big tempo hit, right? You can kill their 2-drop, right? Like, Voltage Surge is perfect for that. But the trade-off, of course, is aggressive decks have a tough time getting through big creatures, so you would like some expensive removal spells too, some things that hit big things, right? But of course, sorry, the trade-off there is you don't want to play like 5-mana cards, 4-mana cards. You don't want to play Twisted Embrace or whatever. This card does both, right? Where you get the 1-mana interaction spell, but you also get the 4 damage interaction spell later in the game by sacrificing, you know, your Iron Apprentice or whatever. That's the other thing too. Sacrificing an artifact is sometimes a benefit in this deck. It's not a drawback. So yeah, I think specifically when you're drafting this deck, take a note of Voltage Surge. I believe it's a higher pick than Kami Flare, and I also think it's a benefit for you, because Kami's Flare goes a little bit earlier than Voltage Surge. I've actually seen Voltage Surge wheel a decent amount of the time, so just some interesting things. I've talked about these artifacts, these small artifacts: Searchlight Companion, Iron Apprentice, Ninja Kunai, Papercraft Decoy, all winning it around like the 59 to high 57 game in hand win rate in mono red. All of these cards are just good bread. Like, I was gonna say bread and butter, but like basically a little bit higher than that. Like, you should prioritize these cards over anything I haven't talked about yet, basically. You know, like, even above some of the other red commons like Simian Sling and Ironhoof Board, those kind of like pretty decent red commons. These cards are great. And like I said, these are kind of honorary red cards. Iron Apprentice in particular is nice because it gives you an early modified creature for no additional mana, essentially. So like your Kami's Flares deal the extra damage. There's just anything that cares about a modified creature, you get that on the house, essentially. Searchlight Companion is just a generically good card, so you're just going to want that card. It gives you an evasive body, gives you 2 bodies to put equipment on or whatever. Ninja's Kunai is a pretty good removal spell in this deck, just a bit worse than the other 2 removal spells, because, you know, one of the other concepts about removal spells in aggro decks is you really want your removal spells in your red decks to do double duty as burn damage, right? Like, they haven't really been printing burn spells that go to the face and go and kill creatures in the last few sets, or the last few years, I would say. It's outside of a few notable exceptions. That's because it's really, really powerful for your removal spell to go to the face in your aggro deck, essentially. Like, one of the problems, of course, when you are facing like a controlling deck as an aggro deck, is if you have too many removal spells, you just like have a clunky hand where you go, okay, I had 2 creatures, but then I drew my other removal spells and I don't have targets immediately, so I'm just like not pressuring. Ninja's Kunai solves that a little bit, or just, spells that go to the face solve that a little bit, because they can get those last few points, and that's just like a pretty big upgrade on a card that doesn't do that. And of course, it has artifact synergies too, triggers your Song Shapers and stuff, cares about, your anvil, it triggers your anvil for a thing leaving the battlefield. And then Papercraft Decoy. Papercraft Decoy is a card that I think is just super solid. It's not quite like a Virus Beetle or a Spirited Companion, where it's like a card advantage 2-drop essentially, but it does an okay job. Your opponent doesn't necessarily want to block this. It's good to sacrifice your Kenzan Smelters and your Anvils if you're black-red. I guess this is where we're getting into the territory of like bread and butter, where it's not a priority, but this is also a card where you really get this late. Like, people generally don't draft this card very highly, so it's kind of a free pickup, and it's a pretty good card in your deck. Song Shaper. Yeah, I want to talk about Song Shaper. Tawashi Song Shaper. Been talking about it a little bit. Again, winning at close to 60% game in hand win rate in mono red. This thing is just responsible for so much damage if your curve is low. So another reason to keep your curve low in this set, when you're drafting this deck, is Song Shaper. Because if you can cast a bunch of 1-drop artifacts, this thing just like hits so hard. And of course it can get blocked, right? But ideally you try to Voltage Surge their blocker, the early blocker. This hits for like 4 or 5. It's also a pretty decent combo with the Boar, the trample trick, right? That can channel +3/+1 and trample. So this is like your premium 2-drop essentially. You really, really want this card. You want as many as you can get to. They're good in multiples. They trigger each other. A word on the Shattered States era. Again, small sample size on this, but it's winning at a pretty reasonable win rate. I found the card to be okay, especially if you're a mono red variant where you really appreciate the second chapter, the +1/+0 to all of your team. Like, sometimes you just cast it and you go, I steal your thing, you're dead. But if that doesn't happen, you go, I steal your thing, I attack you for a bunch. Even if you have more blockers the following turn, the +1/+0 to my team means that my Searchlight Companions are dealing you 4 by themselves, and like your other go-wide creatures, a few go-wide creatures or like evasive creatures are dealing you a lot of damage. So it's a really, really potent tool, but especially if you have Song Shapers and you have the experimental synthesizers. Again, you want to be careful about the expensive cards you put in your deck, and I wouldn't be like dying to put this card in my deck, but if I didn't have those other cards, the synthesizer and the Song Shaper, this is a pretty good top end card. And then more kind of bread and butter cards. Simian Sling, super solid. Just good 1-drop. Again, you want 1-drops. I talked about Unstoppable Ogre. Ironhoof Boar is an interesting one. So this is the 6-mana 5/4 trample haste, and it's good. It definitely deals a lot of damage. You're gonna be channeling this card more often than not. I should probably read that half of the card. 1 in a red, discard the Boar. Target creature gets +3/+1 and gains trample. That's just like a lot of damage out of nowhere. Your opponent often just goes, okay, like, line up decent blocks on your large creature, on your Unstoppable Ogre or something, and they're like, all right, like, take 6 and a few unblocked creatures and you're probably dead. And of course, it's like decent flood insurance if you do flood out a little bit. Like, when you have Experimental Synthesizer in your deck, you do actually tend to hit land drops fairly frequently. So this can you can cast this as 6 mana a lot of the time. And as you're playing, you kind of want to keep an eye out for, oh, do I want to cast this as the combat trick, or do I want to save this for, if your opponent's at like 15 still and you're on 4 or 5 lands, you might want to consider casting this for the 6-mana mode. So just consider that. It is a bit of a non-bow with Experimental Synthesizer, because it's a 6-mana card and you can't channel from exile, obviously. So again, I'm a little bit less likely to play this if I have a lot of synthesizers. But unlike Shattered States era, where I'm unlikely to play that if I have Tawashi Song Shapers, I am more likely to play this card if I have Song Shapers, because this combos well with that card, just dealing like a bunch of damage out of nowhere. And then we have some kind of misfitty red commons I want to talk about that have not been performing particularly well as far as their win rates go, but I have found them to be good in niche situations and in niche builds. So the two cards in particular I'm talking about are Aki Emberkeeper, which is the 2/1 enchantment creature that when a modified creature dies, you make a 1/1 spirit token. And Ambitious Assault, which is the 2 and a red instant creatures you control get +2/+0. And if you control a modified creature, you draw a card. Basically, like, I've had mono red decks where I have a lot of ways to modify creatures, either Iron Apprentices or a lot of Simian Slings, where this Ember Keeper is just like a really big pain for them, because even if they block, I make a 1/1 and I can put the Sling on that, and it just like creates a kind of like a cheap engine. And so, like, I don't think you want this in all of your decks, but just be on the lookout for it. If you do happen to have a lot of those modified payoffs, I think it's an actually okay card. And then Ambitious Assault is a card, if you have that kind of deck, a lot of modified cards, making a bunch of tokens with Ember Keeper, it actually, the +2 effect to your team kills them pretty quickly. So these are more like, kind of things to fill out your deck with, especially because if you're drafting a monocolored deck, you're going to have to play some like kind of like sometimes not so great cards essentially, or close to monocolored deck. So yeah, just keep your eye out. These are playable cards, but they're not going to be great in every deck. Speaking of playable cards, but not going to be great in every deck, we have some uncommons here. Reinforced Ronin, which is the 1-mana 2/2 haste artifact samurai creature that it bounces to your hand at the end of turn. You can cycle it for 2 mana. This card pairs extremely well with the Song Shaper to give +1/+0, with the automaton that gets counters on it to just, every turn you put a counter on it, essentially. That's a really nice combo. I think it is the worst 1-drop, Rabbit Battery, Simian Sling, Iron Apprentice. These are all better cards. But if you have those combos, I'm a little bit more likely to play this card. Just like the fact that it bounces back to your hand each turn is kind of annoying. You often want to be spending all your mana each turn to actually, like, long-term affect the board, at least as long-term as mono red can get, right? Like, for the next 4 turns, I want this to stay on the battlefield. So yeah, it's a niche card, and it can be pretty good with the right cards, but it's not better than the other 1-drops. And then Flame Discharge is the X and a red instant removal spell that deals X to target creature or planeswalker. If you control the modified creature as you cast it, it deals X +2 instead. This one, again, it's very similar to what I was talking about with the previous cards. If you've got Iron Apprentice, that's a nice one because it turns this into a shock fairly early. And then you've got a bit of flexibility where you can, X and red kill a huge thing. But I don't want this card unless I have other, I have a decent number of ways to modify things, essentially. I think it's too inefficient otherwise. Yeah, and the common removal spells are better, which is a decent baseline. So I was saying that my mono red decks want a little bit of grind in them. They often, like, if you can't kill them dead instantly, just like as early as possible, there's not really like burn spells to finish them off and give you some reach. And so, because there's not really like burn spells after you've kind of stopped your initial onslaught and you have kind of like petered out a little bit, you do want some number of ways to grind. And not a ton, but Synthesizer is the absolute best one, of course. If I don't have that, I'm going to push towards, there's a few cards that are kind of like weaker stand-ins. Those being Bronze Plate Boar, Tempered in Solitude, and Heiko Yamazaki. Bronze Plate Boar being the 3-mana 3/2 artifact creature that gets, you reconfigure for 5, and the reconfigure creature gets +3/+2 and trample. Decent way to turn any of your thing into must answer threats. Tempered in Solitude is the 1 red enchantment that whenever something attacks alone, exile the top card of your library. You can play it this turn. Similar-ish effect to Synthesizer, but stops your beatdown plan, essentially. And Heiko Yamazaki, it's the 3/3 for 4 artifact. 3/3 for 4 trampler. Whenever a samurai attacks alone, you can cast an artifact out of your grave. So very just like in the same vein. It just like helps you have a little bit more long game. I'm not really looking to play any of these cards except for maybe the Boar if I already have Synthesizers. Although I'm pushed away from playing Boar if I have Synthesizer because it's a 3-drop and you want to really keep that curve low. Just noting this is similar to the Aki Emberkeeper and Ambitious Assault, like things you can fill your deck out with if you're missing that core part about it. Or that core part of it. All right, just the final stretch here. Traps. So a few 2 traps I want to shout out. Dragon Spark Reactor and Ghost Shintai of Ancient Wars. Dragon Spark Reactor I think is, I might label as the actual biggest trap in the format. As like, I see this in decks a lot, and it's like really, really bad. And I found even in my mono red decks with a lot of artifacts, like The problem with this card isn't necessarily that you need a lot of artifacts with it to make it good. It's more that, like, it's so timing specific and so kind of like exploitable by your opponent that even when you have the right deck for it, it's still mediocre because you need to play this on 2, right? And that means you're not playing a 2-drop that attacks on 2. If you don't play it on 2, it's just like, you know, you can accrue some value on it. Maybe you have the Ronin that bounces to the hand each turn, but playing it off curve is pretty brutal too. Like, when your card is bad on curve and off curve, like, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement for it, you know? And then, like, you know, it can get blown up. So, like, all this, you know, you've invested 2 mana into your turn 2, and then they can kind of punish you for that. Like, ideally, you're saying, okay, I'm investing 2 mana here, but I get paid out later. Like, I'm taking off the turn, not playing on a 2-drop that can attack, but I get paid off later because I get to deal a bunch of damage to the face. But they can definitely disrupt that, right? And so it's like, yes, I've seen games where this does a thing, right? It certainly, like, is threatening in some games. I just believe you're going to be better off if you don't put the card in your deck, essentially. And then Ghost Shintai of Ancient Wars. I don't know if I want to call this a trap exactly. This is the 2-mana 2/2 first strike that when at your end step you can pay a single mana to deal 1 damage to something, or X damage, where X is the number of shrines you control to to target planeswalker or player, not the creatures. It's just a little bit slow. It's just a little bit clunky. I'd rather this slot just be Unstoppable Ogre. Like, 2 mana, like 3 mana 2/2 does not hit that hard. It's hard to block ish, but like, it's still just 2 mana for your, like, a 2-power attacker for 3 mana. And again, when you have synthesizers and the artifact, what's it called, the like on this the Song Shaper, you really want to push your curve low. And you really have to be really careful about the types of expensive cards you're playing. All right, last section here. What do the other colors provide? So, like I mentioned, I don't think you can always be mono red, right? It's not going to be an option. So most often what you're doing is you're pairing it with, like, 5 cards of another color. And there's a few standout things that each color offers. White offers Michiko's Reign of Truth, which is the saga that gives +1/+1 to a creature for each artifact enchantment you control, and then flips into a backside where it's, like, you know, as big as the number of artifacts and enchantments you control. You're going to have mostly artifacts in your deck, but this pushes, like, a heck of a lot of damage just, like, out of nowhere. It actually pretty quickly gets out of hand. So this is a card I've splashed in, you know, the one time I've been white as my secondary color, and it's been, like, fantastic. Just one of the really, really great cards you can play that actually supplements something to the white decks, or to the red deck, sorry. I want to mention, too, a lot of the best white cards actually don't play well in this deck. Like, Spirited Companion is a 2-mana 1/1. Yes, it draws you a card, but that's not what this deck wants. Oath, right? Imperial Oath is a 6-mana card. That's not what this deck wants, right? And then, of course, you could play some removal spells like Touch the Spirit Realm, Intercessor's Arrest, or whatever, but not a huge priority. The biggest thing is Michiko's Reign of Truth. Blue offers the kind of aggressive ninja package with Moonsnare Specialist in particular is pretty good as just, like, a body that gets a blocker out of the way. It's, you know, the 4-mana 2/2 ninja that bounces something. The classic ninja cards, I will say, like the Network Disruptor and Moon Circuit Hacker, I think those are a little bit worse in this deck than Moonsnare Specialist would be, because those cards, kind of like I mentioned before, are very blue intensive, and you don't want to, like, often your mana bases are looking like heavy red with, like, 6 or 5 of your off color source, or, like, your light source, or your light color. So you don't often, like, in the ninja deck, you can go Disruptor into Moon Circuit Hacker into play Disruptor on turn 2 again. That's not going to happen very often here. So it's just, like, not, the synergies don't play as well in a very heavy red deck as they would in a very heavy blue deck, essentially. Suit Up, a pretty good card, pushes damage, is a good trick. An Enthusiastic Mechanaut, which is the blue-red 2/2 flyer. Card is good. Like, it makes your 1-drop artifacts free, right? Which is pretty nice. It makes your 2-drop artifacts, like, pretty close to free. So it's an evasive creature. I found it to be fine. You do have a lot of artifacts in this deck, so you do get to, like, a lot of times I've had some pretty nutty turns where I go, like, Mechanaut on 2, play my Automaton, you know, my artifact that gets counters when I play artifacts, on 3, and then play, like, 2 other artifacts, which is pretty sweet. So yeah, this is a pretty good, one of the bigger things that blue offers. Green doesn't offer anything. That's not completely true, but it offers very, very little. The one card that stands out, of course, is Invigorating Hot Springs. The golden common that, you can give haste to your modified creatures and spread some counters around. This is a good card to play in that deck, but I really want to caution that the green cards do not play well with the red cards. The green cards, for the most part, want to go long. The red cards very much don't want to do that, so be careful of that. And then black. Black, of course, with black-red being the best color combination for if you're not super heavy in red. It's just, Oni Cult Anvil, of course, is a great card. Clawing Torment, which is the 1 mana, aura that you put on something that gives something -1, it can't block, and then at the beginning of the upkeep, they lose 1 life. Such a good removal spell for this deck. Like, exactly what this wants. This is better in black-red than any of the red removal spells are. Because it's just like 1 mana, get a blocker out of the way, you start to lose life. Just fantastic. Just, like, premium. Really, really nice thing that this, that black gives to red. So, yeah. And of course, like, a lot of the black cards play well in red, honestly. It's not like, my black cards, I have to, like, kind of be sneaky and be tricky about which ones I play in my red deck. No, they just naturally play pretty well with the ninjas and stuff. So, that's going to do it. That's all I got to say, everybody. Thank you for hanging out. Again, I'm going to shout out the Patreon. If you like what we're doing here, check that out. And I'm going to send it over to chat for a Q&A. If anybody would like to ask some questions, some clarifications on anything I've said, go a little bit deeper. If I missed anything, I missed a card that I didn't mention. In red, I think I covered a lot of them. But if there's one that you'd like to hear, yeah, I'm just going to send it to chat. And yeah. All right, Small Sam says, I saw you play cards like Gift of Wrath in the other red aura yesterday. What are your thoughts on them? I'm pretty low on them. Yeah, so Gift of Wrath is the 4 mana aura that gives +2/+2 in menace, and when the enchanted creature leaves, you get a 2/2 menace. I don't think that card is great. The decks I was playing them in, I kind of like I was talking about when I was talking about just like kind of needing to play some not so great cards because you're a monocolor deck or trying to be as close to monocolor as possible. I just kind of had to, and it's not the worst card, honestly. I think that card's actually pretty good. Like, it pushes a lot of damage. Like, you want to sneak it in. You want to be really careful. You don't want to get blown out, but often your opponent has to tap out on their turn, because you've got a lot of stuff. Like, they can't just leave up a removal spell. They have to, like, play a blocker or something, because you've gone 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop. So an aura does get a little bit better, especially one that, makes it harder to block. So it's like a passable card, I would say, as, like, one of your lower-end playables. It's acceptable. The concession I guess I'm making, or the trade-off I'm making, is I'm willing to play a worse red card than a better, like, card of my light secondary color, if it means that I don't have to play as many cards as that secondary color. That, essentially, I really, really do value staying close to mono red as possible. Is there any starts to a heavy red draft that would push you more towards mid-range, or is it largely just aggro-focused decks? Yeah, good question. So, yes, for sure. Like, one of the things I maybe didn't mention is I think you really need to be careful about drafting red, because it only performs particularly well with black cards or with other red cards. If red is kind of cut and you're not seeing black cards, you should probably pivot to something else, essentially, right? Don't get locked into red just because it's kind of, after you heard me talking about it here, it's like a cool thing to do. I often, like, I've had the experience where even in the last few days, I'm like, okay, I like drafting red, really try to dial in on it, and then go, oh, okay, no, this is not the draft pod, this is not the draft table to be doing that, right? There has been decks or drafts where I've gone, okay, I started red, I picked up some black cards, now I'm heavy black with some red, that's fine. But there has been drafts where I've gone, okay, no, this just isn't coming together. I should be like blue-white or something like that. So, yeah, be careful about that. What's the latest in a draft you decide to go heavy red? Is pack 2 too late? Good question. So it's kind of, there's a lot of ebb and flow with that for sure. It's not like, I don't think it's ever like too late, but again, you have to be careful because you're trying to stay close to monocolored. You do risk not reaching playables if you like try to dive in mid pack 2 or something. I think more than any other deck, you should try to solidify if you are like figure out if you are doing it or aren't doing it in pack 1. I don't think I would necessarily want to move into mono red in pack 2 or like close to mono red unless you really don't have great options, essentially, right? Like, unless you're just like, there's nothing at this table that's powerful, but I see red is open, then I feel more comfortable being like, okay, I'll get enough cards in pack 2 and pack 3, but again, just like, it's something that you should really be careful about. So if I understand you correctly, it's better to be low mana value instead of curving out. 3-2 Boar versus Synthesizer. So, you're still curving out. I would still classify it as curving out. You're just curving out instead of 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, 4 drop. You're going 1 drop, 2 drop, and then on turn 3 going 2 into 1, and then on turn 4 going 2 into 2. You know what I mean? So it's like you're still filling in, you're still spending it all your mana each turn, but the downside of going, I'm stuck on 2 lands, I can't play my 3 drop isn't there, and the downside of going, my Synthesizer hit a 3 drop on turn 3, that's a nightmare, isn't there as often. So, yeah, it's still a curve out deck, just not up the curve. You know what I mean? Another card I've been impressed with is Seismic Wave. Yes, that's a good one. I didn't actually talk about that one. So Seismic Wave is a 3 mana instant. It deals 2 to any target, and then 1 to all the non-artifact creatures your opponent controls. So essentially deals 3 to some non-artifact creature, but it can clean up like Go-Shintai tokens. It can clean up like Searchlight Companions token, a few other things. There's just like, a lot of X-ones in the format. Mind you, a lot of them are artifacts. But yeah, I found the card to be good. It's worse than the common removal spells, I would say, but like, because it's 3 mana, but better than like Flame Discharge, the other uncommon red card. What are your thoughts on 4 drops, particularly Scrapyard Steelbreaker and Tawashi Guidebot? Steelbreaker I don't like very much. Like, it's just expensive. It can be chumped. Obviously, it's good with Boar in particular, with the +3 trample trick. But it's not at all a card I would prioritize. I just don't think it does. Like, it doesn't do anything that the 2s and 1s can't do, essentially. And then Tawashi Guidebot, which is the 4 mana artifact creature 2/1 that can draw you some cards. So I've played that card in like a red-black sort of aggressive deck, like sort of aggressive leaning deck that is still trying to grind a little bit. It's not like red, like heavy red trying to kill you immediately. And it does play well with a low curve because you want to, like, the problem with that card often is it's one of the first, like, if you're a green deck and you go like 2 drop into like that card on 4, maybe you're like casting like, I don't know, something that doesn't affect the board on 3, or like something that doesn't block that well on 3, like, you often have to block with that card early. But if you're the aggressor and they have to answer your stuff, like, they answer your 2 and your 3 and your 1 or whatever, then you play the Guidebot to refill. It's like pretty decent. I would say in an actual like close to mono red deck, you still don't want the card though, because you don't want to dedicate like a 4 mana card for the purposes of refilling. Like, you've already got like the Synthesizers and those other red cards that I talked about that helped grind in the late game, like, the Tempered in Solitude and the Boar. I guess it's like in a similar space as Heiko, where it's still a 4 mana thing, but Heiko attacks you pretty well. So yeah, I guess the combination of you don't want to dedicate expensive cards to grinding, and it's kind of fragile for 4 mana, and there's just better ways to grind, means I don't really see myself playing the card very often. Did I comment on Ogre Helm? I didn't. This is a 2 mana rare reconfigure, gives the thing +2/+2. It's a 2 mana 2/2, gives the reconfigured creature +2/+2, and when it hits your opponent, you can sacrifice the Helm or the equipped creature to discard your hand and draw 3 cards. I think it is solid, but not amazing. I think that the Song Shaper is better than that card. Like the Tawashi Song Shaper in a heavy red deck than the Ogre Helm. So, yeah, it's not in that same tier of rares I was talking about, like Etsushi and, the Kaiju and that kind of stuff. Like, it's like a okay common, essentially. In a draft where you start red, do you preferentially pick cards that could go into another deck if red is cut, or do you just accept that you'll be red or you'll pivot out of red? Great question. So I generally think, yeah, I'm gonna try to, like, I try to draft with the optimism of, yes, I will see the red cards I need, and if I'm not, it usually means that I'm gonna see other cards of other colors. I mean, I feel comfortable, like, other good cards of other colors, and I'm comfortable pivoting out of the lane I'm doing, right? Like, if I see other good, like, good green cards, green is miraculously open, I see good ninjas or something, I'm like, okay, cool. Like, that's, I'll go down that path. I'm not that sad about giving up my base red deck. But I guess in a close situation where like I'm not giving up too much. Like I think that's a good strategy. Like if there's a tiebreaker, the tiebreaker can be, yes, this card goes in another deck, goes in a kind of an exit strategy deck while playing well in my red deck too. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up from there. Man, that was info dense. I really hope that this was helpful. I hope that you all start to draft red decks sometime soon, but not too many, not too soon and not too many, because I still want to draft them. Thank you all for hanging out. Really appreciate it. Again, if you want to catch this, if you haven't caught it live, and you're listening, it is on the YouTube, where I post these all the time. Every time I stream one to Twitch. And yeah, it's there with visuals if you want to see those. And yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.